Hello and welcome to Rules of the Game, where three lawyers demystify the rules nonprofits have to follow when they're advocating on the issues they care about. I'm Tim Mooney.
I'm Leslie Barnes.
And I'm Quyen too. And we're attorneys at Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy program. Every day we take calls and emails from nonprofits on how to safely and boldly take stances on women's health, climate change, civil rights, and much more.
On this show, we'll talk about some of the greatest hits, questions we get every day. We try to keep the jargon to a minimum, but if you're new to nonprofit advocacy work, check out our starter video at boulderadvocacy.org/start.
I am so thrilled to be launching the first episode of Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy program, Rules of the Game. It's so exciting to be here because we've been talking about this for months to launch a podcast, because this is a new platform, a new way for us to be able to explain these rules, which can sometimes be a little bit opaque, in a way that's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more relatable, in a little bit more of a casual setting that podcasting basically offers us. Leslie, what do you think?
I think you've set the bar pretty high, but I think we have our first disagreement. So you said we've been thinking about the podcast for a couple months now. Quyen and I know we've been thinking about the podcast for well over a year now, but the shutdown gave us a good chance to put our heads together. And so if the background's changed a little bit, it's because I'm isolating at my brother's house, but we are so excited that we knew that we needed to get underway.
You know, and as an avid podcast listener myself, I was so thrilled and honored to be able to have the opportunity to sit on the other side of the mic and produce content for our listeners, because I know we have a profound amount of information at Boulder Advocacy and the resources that we have up there. But this medium of audio and podcasting allows us to reach groups and people that may otherwise never be able to come to a training or access our material. So I am thrilled and excited to be able to bring something useful.
And if you're a real AFJ head, like you've been around for a minute, this is not our first foray into podcasting. Back in 2005, we actually had a podcast called Supreme Court Watch, which is from our justice side of the office. Of course, we're going to be on the Boulder advocacy side of things, but AFJ was a pioneer in all of this. So it's good to be back. It feels like a comfortable pair of slippers to slide into to be podcasting again. So on this episode, our inaugural episode, we're going to talk about the one rule on election year advocacy that every 501c3 needs to know. And that is that you cannot support or oppose candidates for public office out of your organization. So we want you to think about advocacy like a road that you can drive on. You know, there's plenty of room to maneuver, but this one rule sets up guardrails on either side. You can't support a candidate on one side. You can't oppose a candidate on another. If you cross over or break through those guardrails, you're going to fall down a deep metaphorical legal cliff.
And that's right, since we want you to continue to keep speaking during an election year, because it's a great time to elevate your issues. You've got candidates, voters, even elected officials paying attention. So this is a great time to elevate the issues. If your organization works on environmental issues and you're working with indigenous groups like Earth Justice, there's so many ways that your organization can speak out and engage with voters and candidates without allowing your organization's resources to be used to intervene in an election. And Quyen's going to help us understand how the IRS and your organization can analyze and view your issue advocacy to stay safe.
I think it makes the most sense to start with the focusing on the guardrails in this scenario, because it really does define what can happen on the road. And the rule that we are working with here is the IRS says 501c3s must be nonpartisan. Normal people would think nonpartisan is referring to a political party, right? But here, you have to keep in mind that 501c3s must not support or oppose a candidate is what the IRS means when it says that 501c3s must be nonpartisan. And to determine whether or not a 501c3 is nonpartisan, the IRS looks at the facts and circumstances. The three of us will be the first to admit that this is a very subjective risk analysis that takes into account all sorts of different factors. We're only going to focus on 6 of them that the IRS will definitely look at in our show today.
So these 6 factors are part of what is commonly called the facts and circumstances analysis. So welcome. The first of those factors that we're going to talk about today is track record of advocacy. So the IRS considers issue advocacy that's done well before an election season to be much less likely a proxy for supporting or opposing candidates. Now, you know what? The opposite is also true. If you're parachuting in on a topic on the last minute before an election, well, the IRS is much more likely to consider that activity to be partisan in nature. So all of these different factors sort of work and flow together. One factor alone isn't necessarily dispositive. The IRS looks at everything in context, including the other 5 factors we're going to talk about here.
That's right. The next factor, in addition to track record, is going to be timing. So is your communication or activity far away from an election or close to an election? What tweet might have been really safe in the spring, said the same way a week before an election, could be a lot more risky. And so the tweet we're going to look at the timing. And as Tim said, sometimes no one factor is more dispositive of the other. But then sometimes, depending upon all the facts and circumstances, one factor becomes more significant, more dispositive.
The third factor that we'll look at is a question of what's driving the activity or communication. We're looking really in this scenario at what are the events that are outside of the organization's control and are unrelated to the election. So examples include legislation that may be pending, a lawsuit where a verdict is announced, executive order that is signed, or the anniversary of major victory.
So in the fourth factor that the IRS will commonly look at, it has to do with references or the presence or absence of references to candidates or elections in the communications. So one thing that we often say, based on the IRS's track record of enforcement in this area, is that mixing your issue advocacy with references to voters, candidates, or elections themselves, now that tends to be a factor that the IRS considers partisan in nature. But you know what? That's not true for things outside of issue advocacy. There's a whole host of things. We mentioned this analogy about driving on this big wide road. There's tons of things that C3s can do around elections. Some of those things include nonpartisan get out the vote efforts, nonpartisan voter education, nonpartisan voter registration. And we're going to be talking about that being firmly between the guardrails on future podcasts. But those types of things, obviously you're going to be talking about elections and candidates and things along those lines. So it's really with issue advocacy that those references become a factor that breaks against an organization. For example, one thing that's particularly over those guardrails, comparing your nonprofit's position on any given issue to what the candidates are saying while they're on the stump. The IRS may see that as a tacit endorsement or tacit opposition to the candidates, and that can be a bag of hurt for you and your organization. You may be crashing through those guardrails and going over that deep metaphorical cliff I keep talking about.
There's absolutely a way to keep talking, right? And keep engaging in your advocacy without going over that cliff. So as Tim said, if you tie your issue advocacy to a candidate, then that can be more risky. So that's a verbal way of tying your advocacy to a candidate or an election and kind of tipping off your readers or your listeners or followers. But another way that's a non-visual way that could get you in trouble is your targeting. So are you targeting your communication to a broad audience, or are you targeting your communication to try to influence the outcome of an election? Are you sending your mailing, or are you paying for an online ad that's being targeted into a group of undecided voters? That's highly risky, but that's not a visual type of, that's not something you're going to see in the communication. That's something you're going to have to drill down for and think about and talk about within your organization. So targeting matters as well.
The sixth factor that we'll cover on this show is all about wedge issues that are high profile and divide the candidates. So these are really hard to talk about in the abstract because they're not everyday things. But if I name some for you, like the US Mexico wall, or being pro choice or pro life, related to an election or a get out the vote campaign or about a candidate, then if your C3 is mentioning these issues in a particular way, it could signify that your organization is supporting or opposing a particular candidate. So, to sum up, the six factors are: number one, track record of advocacy; number two, timing relative to the election; number three, what's driving this activity or communication; number four, references to candidates or elections or comparing candidates' positions; number five, targeting based on the election; and number six, wedge issues.
If we haven't been really obvious about this yet, I'm going to reiterate it one more time. Context is everything. This is a holistic analysis that looks at every single factor. In a sense, these six factors aren't everything that the IRS is going to look at, but frankly, it's probably the biggest six things that they do look at. One thing that you didn't notice us say at all: intent. We get phone calls and emails all the time from folks asking, hey, well, what if we didn't mean to intervene in an election? Well, guess what? IRS doesn't care at all what your intent is. It cares about what your communication is in context, looking at the facts and circumstances. That is the facts and circumstances analysis. So the nature of this being so fuzzy means our best analysis, and we've got years of it here just on this podcast here, it's rarely going to be more definitive than being able to offer degrees of risk. There's very rarely going to be bright lines saying, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not okay. So we like to use a stoplight analogy. Red light, super risky. Green light, low or perhaps no risk. And yellow light is somewhere in between. And as we'll talk about in some of the examples that we'll be talking about in this podcast, and the one on this episode in particular, sometimes you can change the nature of the communication. Let's say you're at a yellow light and your organization isn't willing to take the risk. And by the way, the risk, if you go over these guardrails, it's not really a cliff. It's possibly loss of your tax status or some kind of an excise tax. If your organization is not really interested in suffering those types of risks for the IRS finding that you went over these guardrails, well, you can tweak the communication that you have, maybe lower it from a yellow light down to a green light. And we're going to use an example to show how the facts and circumstances analysis works in that kind of a context. We'll tweak the facts and show how you can change a little bit of languaging or change a little bit of the timing and get to a different result in terms of the risk assessment that we would be grading it.
All right, let's talk about this tweet from Earth Justice that was released on July 2nd. It reads, "The Trump administration rushed the approval of the Dakota Access Pipeline, a massive crude oil pipeline that is endangering the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. We're still in court to stop this pipeline for good." And then it links to a post from Earth Justice that talks about the history of their advocacy and the litigation that they've engaged in with the Dakota Access Pipeline issue. So, to start off this analysis, we are going to say this is low to no risk tweet, right? There's nothing here that triggers any kind of red flag, but we also wanted to use it so that we can go through the facts and circumstances analysis to show you and to better understand why we say this is low to no risk.
That's right. So the way we got to our conclusion that this was the kind of a green light tweet is we looked at the factors. We applied the factors to this example. And so what kind of jumped out at me is the long track record that Earth Justice has on litigating these types of environmental challenges. They have a decades-long track record, and they are pointing out their track record in this tweet. I'm looking at the last sentence where it says, "We're still in court to stop this pipeline for good." And so they're talking about imminent decision that was going to come, a decision that did come down 4 days after this tweet was posted. Yeah, what else do you guys see?
I want to refer back to factor number 4, where we were talking about mentioning an elected or a candidate. So here, we of course know that Trump wears a lot of different hats at this time period, right? He is our sitting president, and he is also running for re-election, which makes him a candidate. But this tweet specifically refers to the Trump administration's rushed approval, not his campaign. So context of this really matters, because this is a comment or a commentary about his activity as president overseeing the defendants in this lawsuit. It has nothing to do with his campaign.
One of the factors that can tend to be dispositive in any given analysis, not always, but often, is timing. Factor number 2 that we talked about. Now, in this instance, this came out in July of 2020. So we're several months away from an election, but it's not like we're so far away that it's something that we don't want to be paying attention to. You know, obviously, Donald Trump is running for president during this time, as Quinn mentioned, wearing a lot of different hats, but the timing factor, it's not quite so hot yet. A lot of folks will ask us, hey, when does election season begin? Can we just point to a calendar and give me a date? And the answer to that is you can't do that as part of the facts and circumstances analysis. It's really going to be very context driven. But where we're sitting here right now in July of 2020, as we're recording this, we're close to an election, but not so close that I think a tweet like this is going to have any kind of an elevation in risk given all of the other factors there. So we're going to say green light, minimal risk here.
And kind of flowing off the factor of timing is there an external factor that is causing Earthjustice to speak now in July? And so I would think, if I was talking to Earthjustice, if they called our TA hotline, and I know they've got a great team of lawyers, but if an organization was to call, I might ask them, why are you speaking now on July 2nd? And they might tell me, we've litigated this case. The decision is imminent. So we're talking about ongoing litigation. And as Tim said, in the terms of timing, so if you're talking and communicating and engaging in advocacy close to something that is separate from the election, right? That it's close to litigation, close to a decision, close to an executive order. It's much less risky than if your timing moves up and it looks like you're saying it to try to influence the outcome of the election. Next, I think Quinn's going to have some fun. She's going to change up the facts a little bit.
Yes, let's all jump into the deep end of the pool and move the timing. We've alluded to it, so let's just do it. All of a sudden, we're now in very deep waters, right? So this tweet, let's say, did not come out in July, but we're now releasing it in October of 2020, a week before the November fall election. Well, that obviously means that there could be some higher risk associated with it if all that caused us to release the tweet is the election, and we wanted to call attention to the fact that the Trump administration has failed, or some other reasons to influence the candidate election outcome. But if the timing was linked to something else independent of the election, like, the appeal from this litigation is being released and we have a higher court making an opinion about what's happening, then that doesn't mean that just because we're right on the cusp of an election that this tweet becomes riskier.
Yeah, I like what you were doing there with that. So let's back up a little bit. Let's assume that maybe that there isn't some external factor. There isn't some non-election related reason why this tweet comes out in late October. But there is a way to put this exact tweet out, I think, and make it a lower risk scenario. And that is to drop the reference to Donald Trump. If you drop the name of the candidate from this, and of course it says Trump administration, you could conceivably just drop the name Trump out of that and say the administration. I still think that there's some degree of risk because it's very clear that you're linking the administration of the person who happens to be running for re-election at that point. You could go even one step further. One of the named defendants, or the principal named defendant, in fact, for this lawsuit, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers is not running for re-election. So by replacing the reference to the Trump administration with the named defendant, that really lowers the temperature down. You're taking a stance on this issue related to a lawsuit that you filed, and you've absolutely removed any reference to the election or anybody running for the election. That brings it much closer to a green light, which member organization of Alliance for Justice, Earth Justice, I like to give that little plug in. Hi, everyone. That's the kind of thing that they could potentially do.
So Tim just made our tweet less risky, into green light territory. I'm going to ramp it up and take this tweet into red light territory. So initially, the external factor driving Earth Justice's tweet in July was the ongoing litigation. Now we're going to say we're in October, litigation is complete, Earth Justice is victorious, and they're going into red light territory. They want to remind folks, sorry, Earth Justice, just this once. They're taking it into red light territory. They want to remind folks that they were victorious and the Trump administration lost. So they're going to use a hashtag, let's say, that says hashtag remember in November when we won the Dakota Access Pipeline. That would not be safe for C3 to engage in. The courts say hashtags, just like any other part of the tweet, like your links, are going to be part of the communication.
We want to thank everyone for joining us, and we want to share with people that Boulder Advocacy has a lot of free resources to help put these rules into practice. Two that I'd like to call to our listeners' attention for this episode include election checklists for 501c3 public charities and election year activities for 501c4 social welfare organizations.
We hope this episode helps make you a Boulder advocate. Join us next time for more ways to maximize your advocacy and make positive change in your community.
We're much more than this podcast. If you've got questions, you can call Boulder Advocacy at 866-NP-LOBBY or email us at advocacy@afj.org. You might even get one of us. If you found the show helpful, please rate us on whatever app you're listening so others can find us.
For more resources mentioned on this show, plus the show notes for this podcast, visit boulderadvocacy.org. On behalf of Leslie and Tim, this is Quyen. Thanks for joining.